Hey everyone, this is your host, Lavelle. Tonight, I'll be taking you to a place surrounded by natural beauty and tranquility. However, the location itself has been anything but. Before we begin, please hit like and subscribe. I'd truly love to welcome you into the fold. Now, turn down the lights and come with me. In the Venetian Lagoon, between Venice and Lido, there is a strip of land that fishermen avoid, that boat captains circle wide around, and that locals still speak about in lowered voices. It doesn't look extraordinary from a distance. A cluster of crumbling buildings, a leaning bell tower, nature that has long since overtaken anything man had tried to build. But the ground beneath that greenery isn't just soil. It's ash, bone, disease, memory. And if the stories are to be believed, something else still lingers there. Known as the most haunted location in the world, this is Poveglia Island.
Welcome to Edenfold.
The recorded history of Poveglia stretches back over 1,000 years to at least 421 AD, when people fleeing barbarian invasions took refuge on the island. It was small, strategic, and for a time, alive with ordinary life, families, fishermen, trade. But its role began to change in the late 18th century. In 1776, the Venetian Republic designated Poveglia as a quarantine station, what was known as a lazaretto. Ships entering the lagoon were inspected, and anyone suspected of carrying disease was sent there. Then came the plague. Not a single outbreak, but waves of it, centuries of recurring infection. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, Poveglia had become a dumping ground for the sick and the dying. Victims weren't treated in any meaningful way. They were isolated, contained, and left to perish. Historical estimates and local accounts claim that more than 100,000 people died on that island. Some say far more. The sick were brought in by boat, often already fevered and delirious. Many never left. There are accounts, repeated in Italian folklore and later investigations, that when the outbreaks became uncontrollable, people showing even the slightest symptom were forcibly taken to Poveglia. Families were separated. The accused were dragged away. The dead were buried in mass graves. When the graves filled, the bodies were burned. Ash from funeral pyres mixed with the soil. Over time, the earth itself changed. Modern visitors and locals alike have claimed that as much as half the island's soil is composed of human ash. And if that isn't dark enough for you, during the height of the Black Death, victims were thrown into pits while still alive, either because they were too weak to resist or because officials feared the disease spreading further. Whether exaggerated or not, the fear of premature burial was real at the time. And on Poveglia, there were no second chances. By the early 1800s, the island had gained the reputation not just for death, but for suffering. Even after the plague subsided, it remained the quarantine zone for decades. Eventually, it was abandoned. For a while. Then, in the 20th century, people returned, not to live, but to confine. A psychiatric hospital was established on the island in the early 20th century, operating between the 1920s and 1960s. The facility reused the existing structures from the quarantine era. No effort was made to rebuild from the ground up. Patients were placed into the same buildings where plague victims had been held, where mass death had already shaped the environment. The main structure, still standing today, served as the primary ward. The bell tower, originally part of a church dating back centuries, was incorporated into the hospital grounds. The hospital was never fully staffed in the way mainland institutions were. It operated in relative isolation, both physically and administratively. Supplies arrived by boat. Transfers in and out were limited. Once admitted, patients could remain there indefinitely. Descriptions of the interior, gathered from urban explorers, historians, and fragments of testimony, paint a clear picture. Long corridors with peeling walls, iron bed frames bolted to the floor, windows barred, some permanently sealed, rooms that retained the smell of damp stone and stagnant air decades after abandonment. Patients were not separated by condition in any particular way. Those suffering from severe psychosis were housed alongside individuals with far less extreme diagnoses. Overcrowding was rampant, particularly during its mid-century operation. And then there are the stories of what began happening inside. Staff members spoke of hearing voices in empty wards, not indistinct noise, but what sounded like conversations just out of reach. Some described hearing their names spoken when no one was present. Patients reportedly reacted more strongly. Individuals with no prior history of hallucinations began seeing the same figures, shadowy forms moving through hallways, standing at the foot of beds, or watching from corners where light didn't reach. These descriptions were not identical, but they followed similar descriptions. Human-like shapes, seen as distorted or incomplete. At night, the activity would intensify. Footsteps were heard moving through corridors that had been locked or cleared. Doors would open or close without explanation. Patients would get agitated at specific times each night, pointing toward empty spaces or attempting to avoid areas of the building entirely. Certain rooms were abandoned altogether by staff, not officially sealed, but informally avoided. Patients placed in those rooms were said to deteriorate rapidly, showing increased paranoia, insomnia, and in some cases, violent behavior. The bell tower itself became a focal point of activity. Even before the legend of the doctor, which I'll get to shortly, there were patients who would hear sounds coming from above, despite the tower not being in regular use. Bells ringing faintly, even though no mechanism remained operational. Movement on the upper levels when no one had been assigned there. Staff responses to these reports varied, depending on the account. Some dismissed them outright as symptoms. Others avoided investigating them alone. And there is no record that clearly explains why so many who passed through that building, patients and staff alike, left with the same kinds of experiences, described in the same specific ways. Over time, the line between illness and environment became harder to distinguish. The same buildings, the same corridors, the same island that had already spent centuries collecting the dead. But the most infamous story tied to this period centers on a doctor. His name is rarely agreed upon, but referred to as Dr. Paolo, Dr. Gallo, or in some cases simply Dr. Torture. He may have been a senior physician or director of the facility. What is solid across the stories of him is what he was said to have done. The doctor believed he could cure mental illness through experimental procedures. These were not standard treatments of the time, even by early 20th century psychiatric standards. Patients were subjected to lobotomies, performed without anesthesia, using crude tools, hammers, chisels, drills. These ghastly procedures having been carried out in the island's bell tower. He experimented with different methods, altering the angle of entry into the skull, attempting variations in technique, sometimes performing multiple procedures on the same patient. Then there are the electroshock treatments, taken beyond medical necessity. Patients restrained for extended periods, psychological torment presented as therapy. Then his behavior began to change. Staff said that he spoke of seeing figures, plague victims, shadows moving through the halls, voices calling from the tower. At first, it was dismissed. Then it became harder to ignore. He grew paranoid, erratic, obsessed. Eventually, driven mad by the shadows of his own victims, he climbed the bell tower and threw himself from the top. But even here, the story doesn't end cleanly. Some say he died instantly upon impact. Others say that he survived the fall, only to be found later, strangled, as if someone, or indeed something, had finished what the fall began. The hospital eventually closed, perhaps due to lack of funding, or maybe due to the deteriorating condition of the buildings. Possibly it was simply because of the twisted reputation of the island itself. After its closure, Poveglia was abandoned once again. In more recent years, Poveglia has drawn the attention of paranormal investigators, journalists, and television crews. Access to the island is restricted by the Italian government, but that hasn't stopped attempts to document what remains. One of the most widely recognized modern investigations of Poveglia Island was carried out by the crew of Ghost Adventures, led by Zak Bagans. The episode aired in 2009 and remains one of the most discussed pieces of footage connected to the island. From the moment the team arrived, the tone was different from their usual occasions. They noted that even before entering the main hospital structure, the island felt physically oppressive. Dense air, silence broken only by water and wind, and no signs of wildlife nearby. They began their investigation inside the abandoned hospital building, the same structure used during the psychiatric era. Early in the lockdown, the crew reported capturing unexplained audio through EVP sessions. These included faint voices that did not correspond to any visible person, some of which were interpreted as Italian phrases. As the night progressed, activity escalated. Zak Bagans entered one of the interior rooms, an area where patients would have been held, and began reacting to a sudden shift in his mental and emotional state. On camera, his demeanor changes noticeably. He becomes agitated, his speech more aggressive, his posture tense. He repeatedly states that he feels rage building without cause. Moments later, something physically made contact with him. Not a light touch, but as a forceful shove to his chest, strong enough to stagger him backward. This occurs while he's standing alone in the room, with no visible interference from crew or environment. The footage shows him recoiling and reacting immediately, insisting that something just pushed him. Following this, his behavior continues to escalate. He becomes confrontational, directing anger toward the unseen presence, shouting, and at one point appearing disoriented. Other members of the team, monitoring from nearby, comment on how abruptly his personality shifted. They eventually remove him from the area to calm him down. The rest of the crew also had their own experiences throughout the investigation. Nick Groff and Aaron Goodwin both heard footsteps in areas they had just cleared. Distinct, paced movement, like someone walking through the halls. When they checked, no one was there. There were also multiple instances of unexplained noises, knocking sounds, distant metallic echoes, and doors moving on their own. In one segment, a loud bang is heard from another part of the building, prompting an immediate search that yields nothing. Aaron Goodwin in particular felt as though he was being followed. At one point, he reacts to a sensation behind him, turning suddenly as if someone had entered his space. He later explains that he felt presence close to him, close enough to trigger a physical response, even though nothing was visible. The team also documented cold spots, sudden drops in temperature localized to specific areas of the building, detected using their equipment. Throughout the investigation, there is a recurring theme in their commentary, the sense that something on the island was not passive, not just residual energy, but something reactive, something that responded to them being there. What made their investigation so compelling wasn't just the activity, but how quickly it hit and how directly it seemed to affect the people involved. The footage and the behavior captured in it has remained one of the most cited modern accounts tied to Poveglia, often referenced alongside the older legends that already surround the island. Independent explorers who have illegally visited the island have encountered similar experiences, hearing whispers in empty buildings, seeing figures in windows where no one should be, and feeling sudden drops in temperature. Some have found human bone fragments embedded in the soil. Fishermen in the lagoon have long avoided the waters around Poveglia, as it is known that fishing nets have pulled up bones instead of fish. Today, Poveglia remains officially uninhabited. In 2014, there was an attempt to lease the island for redevelopment. Plans included turning it into a luxury destination, hotels, private residences. The idea faced heavy opposition from locals, and the project ultimately stalled. The buildings continue to decay. The bell tower still stands, partially intact. Vegetation has consumed much of the island, but beneath it lies the same ground, unchanged in what it holds. Boats still pass by, but rarely stop. And even now, there are reports, quiet ones, of lights seen at night where there should be none. There's a point where history and story stop being easy to separate. Poveglia doesn't need exaggeration to be disturbing. Thousands of people died there in isolation. Bodies were burned into the earth. The place was used again and again for those society wanted removed. First the sick, then the mentally ill. Then there was the doctor with his torturous experiments and his subsequent death. The land itself must scream with despair. I would normally nope out on a visit to any notoriously haunted location. If you've seen my video on the Sally House, you'll know how I feel about it. Poveglia Island, though, I think I'd give it a go. Not alone, of course, but I feel more intrigued than threatened somehow. Or maybe I'm just saying that because I know it's illegal to go and it's just not possible anyways. Tell me what you think of the most haunted island in the world. Would you join me there for a tour if you could? If you stayed with me until the end, I appreciate it, truly. These are the kinds of stories I keep coming back to, the ones that don't quite leave you alone afterwards. If you felt that too, you can leave a like or subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep building Edenfold into something bigger. And if you've ever experienced anything like this, or there's a place you think I should look into, I read the comments, so let me know. And if you want to keep going with me tonight, there's another story waiting on screen right now. I'll meet you there.